In the summer of 1496, city officials across Central Europe began shutting down the bathhouses. Not because they were dirty, because they were killing people. Or so the doctors said. Syphilis had just arrived from the New World, moving through a continent with no immunity and no explanation, and the best medical minds of the age had an answer: the hot water, the steam, the open pores. The bathhouses were the vector, and they had to go. They never really came back. So how did a civilization that inherited Rome's plumbing, its heated pools, its culture of daily public bathing, manage to convince 4 centuries of kings, scholars, and ordinary people that water-touching skin was a form of slow suicide? In 1548, a Parisian physician named Jean Fresnel published a warning that spread across Europe's medical community like doctrine. Hot baths open the pores, and open pores invite plague. His advice was not fringe. It was consensus. The finest doctors of the 16th century agreed that water, especially warm water, was a vector for death. And so Europe stopped bathing. Not all at once. Not with a single decree, but over the course of a generation, the educated classes, the people with the resources to heat water and the leisure to use it, walked away from washing. They replaced it with dry linen and perfumed powder. A clean shirt became the mark of a clean body. Water-touching skin became, in the minds of Europe's best-trained minds, something close to suicide. Here is what makes this almost impossible to accept. These same Europeans were the heirs to Rome. 1,000 years before Fresnel wrote his warning, Roman engineers had built the baths of Caracalla in the heart of Rome, a complex that served over 8,000 bathers a day across nearly 1 million square feet. The floors were heated from beneath by circulating hot air through hollow tiles. The rooms were sequenced by temperature, cold to warm to hot, because the Romans understood that bathing was a science as much as a pleasure. At the empire's peak, Rome had over 900 public baths operating simultaneously. That knowledge did not disappear overnight. It was buried slowly under the weight of a new idea that water itself was the enemy. The logic was not entirely irrational, which is what made it so dangerous. Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries was genuinely ravaged by epidemic disease. Plague returned again and again. People watched their neighbors die in waves, and they looked for causes. When doctors proposed that open pores created entry points for pestilential air, the theory fit what people were seeing. The baths closed. The rivers grew quieter. The homes grew closer and darker, and, though no one yet had the language for it, far more dangerous in exactly the ways the physicians were trying to prevent. 400 years. That is how long this consensus held. Across wars, revolutions, the rise and fall of empires, the invention of the printing press and the telescope and the steam engine, Europe's medical establishment maintained that bathing posed more risk than protection. Kings and queens, philosophers and scientists lived their entire lives without once submerging in water with the intent to clean themselves. The smell of a royal court in 1600 would stop you at the door. But the story does not end there, because inside a single generation, in the mid-19th century, everything reversed. The question is what changed. And the answer involves one of the most stubborn battles in the history of medicine. In the year 60, a Roman soldier stationed at the edge of the known world, in a cold, rain-soaked province called Britannia, could walk into a fully heated public bath complex and spend his afternoon there. Not as a luxury, as an ordinary Tuesday. The town was called Aqueducts. We call it Bath. The Romans sank pipes into natural hot springs, enclosed them in vaulted stone chambers, and built a social institution around water that entire legions expected as a basic condition of civilized life. This was not the capital. This was the frontier. That tells you everything about the scale Rome was operating at. The engineering alone was staggering. Under the floors of every major bathhouse, Roman builders constructed a system called a hypocaust, a raised floor supported by hundreds of small brick pillars with hot air circulating through the gap beneath. The rooms above were warm without a single flame visible. The Romans had essentially invented radiant floor heating, and they deployed it across a continent. Water to feed these complexes came from aqueducts that moved millions of gallons daily across mountains and valleys, some of them spanning dozens of miles without a pump, using only precision-engineered gravity gradients. Rome's city alone had 11 major aqueducts running simultaneously. The water pressure they generated was high enough to supply upper floors of buildings. Bathing in Rome was not something you did alone in private. You went daily. You met business contacts there, argued politics, made deals, raised children. The bath was where Roman civic life actually happened. Free admission was common. Senators and slaves used the same water. At the empire's height, the city of Rome had over 900 operating baths. Provincial cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East had their own. This was a continent-wide infrastructure of cleanliness, built into the bones of daily life. Then, across roughly 2 centuries, it collapsed entirely. What replaced it was not simply absence. Something actively moved in to fill the space Rome left behind, and that something would hold Europe in its grip for 400 years. By the 9th century, Paris had public bathhouses operating on the banks of the Seine. So did London. So did Cologne, Vienna, and Frankfurt. Dozens of cities across Europe never actually stopped bathing after Rome fell. They just stopped doing it the Roman way. The bathhouses that survived the empire's collapse were smaller, simpler, and run for profit. Medieval Europeans called them stews, a word that came from the Old French word for a heated room. By the 1200s, London alone had 18 licensed stew houses operating on the south bank of the Thames. They were regulated by law. Prices were posted. Hours were set. The city of Paris had its own guild of bathhouse keepers, the Etavistes, with formal rules governing how the business was run. These were not grim, utilitarian places. That matters. Medieval bathhouses were social institutions in the same spirit as their Roman predecessors. You went with friends. You ate there. Bathhouse keepers sold food and wine to customers soaking in large wooden tubs, sometimes shared between strangers, sometimes between couples. In German towns, mixed bathing was common enough that it scandalized visiting outsiders, who wrote home about it in detail, which is how we know it happened. In some cities, a trip to the bathhouse was explicitly romantic. Illuminated manuscripts from the 1400s show men and women sharing baths, musicians playing nearby, servants carrying platters of food. This was not hidden. It was painted and illustrated and documented as an ordinary feature of European social life. The stews were tied to barbershops, to medicine, to the rhythms of the week. Saturday was bath day in many communities, a tradition that persisted long enough to leave a mark on language. In parts of Germany, the word for Saturday, Samstag, carried associations with washing well into the early modern period. So Europe was washing. Medieval Europe was visibly, enthusiastically, communally bathing for centuries after Rome. which makes the question sharper and stranger than the myth ever allowed. If it wasn't Rome's fall that ended the bath culture, something else did. Something that arrived fast enough to shut down thousands of bathhouses across a continent within a single generation. What came next did not smell like progress. In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina carrying sailors who were already dying. The port authorities ordered the ships back out to sea. It was too late. Within months, the plague was moving north. By 1348, it had crossed the Alps. By 1349, it had reached England, Germany, and Scandinavia. In some cities, half the population was dead within a year. In others, more than half. Florence lost 60,000 people. Paris lost 50,000. The numbers were so staggering that survivors stopped counting and started praying. The physicians who remained alive had no explanation that fit what they were seeing. Nothing in Galen, nothing in Avicenna, accounted for something that killed this fast and this indiscriminately. They fell back on the one theory that seemed to fit: miasma. Corrupted air. The idea that invisible particles of disease floated through the atmosphere and entered the body through the breath, through the eyes, through the skin itself. That last detail is where everything changed. If disease entered through the skin, then anything that opened the skin became a weapon against you. And what opened the skin faster than anything else? Hot water. Physicians began writing that a hot bath dilated the pores, softened the flesh, and left the body defenseless against the corrupted air rising from the mass graves that now surrounded every European city. The bathhouse, where steam hung thick and strangers pressed together in shared tubs, suddenly looked less like a civic amenity and more like a killing room. In Paris, the medical faculty at the Sorbonne issued guidance warning against bathing during the epidemic. Other physicians followed. The advice spread faster than any organized campaign could have managed, because it arrived alongside genuine terror and seemed, in the absence of anything better, to make sense. The bathhouses did not close overnight, but the trust was cracking. People who had bathed communally every week of their lives began to hesitate. The Saturday ritual that had survived the fall of Rome, the Carolingian winters, the Crusades, was now being weighed against survival. And as the plague returned again in 1360, 1362, 1374, that hesitation hardened into something else entirely. In the 1490s, a new disease appeared in Europe with a speed and brutality that stopped cities cold. Soldiers in the French army campaigning in Naples were among the first to show symptoms. Open sores, fevers, lesions that ate through flesh and eventually bone. It spread through the ranks, then back across the Alps, then across the continent. Within a decade, almost no country was untouched. Every country blamed someone else. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. Everyone else called it the French disease. History would call it syphilis. The timing could not have been worse for Europe's bathhouses. By the 1490s, the bathhouses that had survived the plague decades were already operating under a cloud of suspicion. But they were still operating. In cities like Paris, Bruges, and Vienna, they remained social anchors, places where men and women shed rank along with their clothes, shared tubs, took meals, and conducted business. That mixing of bodies and classes was the point. It was also, now, the problem. Bathhouses had always been places where prostitution happened. Authorities knew it, tolerated it, taxed it, and looked away. The word for bathhouse keeper in several European languages had quietly become a slang term for brothel keeper. When syphilis arrived and physicians began tracing its transmission through sexual contact, they did not need to construct a complicated argument. The connection was obvious. The bathhouse was where bodies met strangers. The bathhouse was where the disease spread. Municipal governments acted fast. Cologne closed its bathhouses. Paris followed. Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Frankfurt. One by one, the doors were bolted. Some cities framed it as a temporary public health measure. Most never reopened. The closure orders did not happen in isolation. They arrived alongside sermons from pulpits declaring that the disease was divine punishment for exactly the kind of behavior that bathhouses facilitated. Contagion and moral danger collapsed into a single warning. Bathing was not just dangerous now. It was suspect. To undress in a shared space, to immerse yourself in communal water, was to advertise a willingness to do worse things. Within a generation, the institution that had stood at the center of European civic life for 1,000 years was gone. What replaced it was something stranger than absence. It was a new theory of cleanliness built without water that would hold Europe in its grip for centuries. By the 1500s, the men who decided how Europe understood disease had a name for what was killing people: miasma. Corrupted air, the invisible poison rising from swamps, rotting matter, open sewers, and the breath of the sick. You could not see it. You could not taste it, but it entered the body and it killed. This was not fringe thinking. This was the consensus of the most educated physicians in Europe, men trained at Bologna, Paris, and Padua, working from texts that went back to Galen and Hippocrates. They had inherited a framework 2,000 years old, and syphilis and plague had done nothing to shake it. If anything, the epidemics confirmed it. Disease spread through air. Air entered the body through the lungs, through the mouth, and critically through the pores of the skin. The pores were the problem. Open them and you opened a doorway. Hot water, physicians wrote, dilated the pores, softened the flesh, and left the body defenseless against whatever pestilence was moving through the air that day. The logic was tight. The bathhouse was a hot, steaming room full of sick and healthy people alike, all of them with their pores thrown wide open. Of course, disease spread there. The science explained it perfectly. What the science demanded then was closure, not just of bathhouses, but of bathing itself. Leading physicians across France, Italy, and Germany began codifying this into formal medical doctrine. Jean Fernel, one of the most respected physicians in 16th century France, warned explicitly against hot baths. His counterparts in the German states and Italian city republics echoed him. These were not village healers issuing folk warnings. These were royal physicians, university professors, men whose opinions moved courts and shaped policy. When they agreed that water was dangerous, the educated classes listened. The paradox hardened into received wisdom. Dirt was protection. A layer of grime on the skin sealed the pores. It kept the corrupted air out. To stay dirty was to stay defended. Cleanliness, in the new medical language of the 16th century, was recklessness. Fear had found its theory. Superstition had put on a scholar's robes. What no one had yet worked out was how you were supposed to appear clean, maintain social standing, and never touch water. Someone was going to have to solve that problem. And they did, in a way that now seems almost impossible to believe. The solution arrived not from medicine, but from fabric. Specifically, from linen. Sometime in the 16th century, European physicians and natural philosophers converged on a new idea. Linen, they argued, did not merely cover the skin. It actively cleaned it. The fibers pressed against the body drew out sweat, oils, and the impurities that water had once washed away. Change your shirt, and you had, in effect, bathed. The linen did the work. This was the new hygiene, and Europe embraced it completely. A wealthy man in Paris or Florence would change his linen shirt once a day, sometimes twice. A nobleman might own dozens of shirts for this precise purpose. The shirt was not clothing. It was a tool, a filtration system worn against the skin. The more shirts you owned, the cleaner you were. The poor, who owned one shirt and washed it rarely, were therefore dirty in a way that had nothing to do with visible grime and everything to do with access. At Versailles, Louis XIV made the daily shirt change a ceremony. Attending the king's dressing ritual, the levee, was a political honor granted to the most important nobles at court. The moment the clean linen touched the royal skin was a moment of purification, witnessed and acknowledged. What the king did not do was wash. What he did instead, along with the rest of the French court, was apply perfume. Heavy, dense, costly perfume layered over unwashed skin, changing with the season and the occasion. Cleanliness had become entirely a matter of scent management and textile discipline. The visible proof of all this was worn at the wrist and throat. White linen cuffs and collars extended beyond the outer garments, bright and crisp against wool and velvet. That whiteness was the signal. It told everyone in the room that fresh linen lay underneath, that the body inside the expensive clothes was, by the standards of the age, clean. A grayed cuff was a social catastrophe. It meant you had been wearing the same shirt too long. It meant you were, by definition, dirty. For nearly 400 years, this system held. It had its own logic, its own social codes, its own economics. But somewhere in the mid-1700s, a few scientists began asking questions that the linen theory could not survive. In 1846, Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that women giving birth in Vienna's first maternity clinic were dying at 5 times the rate of those in the second. The difference between the two wards was the doctors. Specifically, what was on their hands when they arrived from the autopsy room. Semmelweis ordered hand washing with chlorinated lime solution. The death rate collapsed. He had found something real, something measurable, something that killed. He had no idea what it was. That was the problem the 19th century kept running into. The evidence was accumulating faster than the explanations. Cholera tore through London in 1854, and physician John Snow traced every death back to a single water pump on Broad Street. Not bad air. Not moral failure. A pump. He mapped it, proved it, and had the handle removed. The outbreak stopped. But Snow, too, could not yet name what was in the water. The naming came from 2 men working separately and arriving at the same answer. Louis Pasteur, a French chemist, demonstrated in the 1860s that fermentation and putrefaction were caused by living microorganisms, not spontaneous chemical decay. Life caused rot. Living things caused disease. Then Robert Koch, a German physician, went further. Working through the 1870s and 80s, he identified the specific bacterium behind anthrax, then tuberculosis, then cholera. He did not theorize. He showed them under the lens, cultured them, proved their role, and established the criteria by which any microbe could be confirmed as a cause of disease. The implications hit the old doctrine like a wrecking ball. Miasma, the invisible poison rising from filth and air, had never been a thing you could isolate or culture or kill with chlorinated lime. But bacteria were real. They lived in contaminated water. They lived in unwashed wounds. They did not live. in any meaningful sense, in clean skin disturbed by bathing. The entire architecture of fear that had kept Europe dry for 400 years was built on nothing. The question now was how long it would take the world to admit it. By 1900, the bath was back. Not as luxury, not as moral hazard, not as the reckless invitation to plague it had been called for 4 centuries. As duty, as medicine, as the single most important thing an ordinary person could do to stay alive. Germ theory did not just correct the old consensus, it demolished it so completely that within a single generation, the textbooks rewrote themselves. Doctors who had warned patients against bathing were now prescribing it. Municipal governments were building public bathhouses. Soap manufacturers, once peddling a minor comfort, became pillars of public health campaigns. The message was everywhere. Clean skin blocked disease. Dirty skin invited it. Everything the previous 400 years had believed was exactly catastrophically backwards. The plumbing followed. Indoor pipes, pressurized water, the ceramic bathtub fitted into ordinary working-class homes across Europe and America. By 1920, a bathroom was not a luxury. It was an expectation. The infrastructure of fear had been replaced brick by brick with the infrastructure of cleanliness. What had taken centuries to build collapsed in decades. That speed is the part worth sitting with. Because the doctors who spent their careers warning patients away from water were not stupid. They were not corrupt. They had read the literature, consulted the authorities, and arrived at the position that nearly every expert of their era held. The consensus was real. It was just wrong. The evidence that overturned it was not a matter of opinion or politics. It was bacterial cultures under a lens. It was death rates that dropped when people washed their hands. Consensus is not truth. It is the best available interpretation of available evidence. When the evidence changes, the interpretation must follow. No matter how long the old one stood, no matter how many credentialed voices defended it. Europe stopped bathing for 400 years because the experts agreed it was dangerous. The experts were wrong. The bath came back. The fear did not. And the only thing that changed was the evidence.